Hello, everybody. I got a special podcast for you guys today, but it requires a bit of an introduction. The first podcast I ever recorded was with a gentleman by the name of Fred Kiel. Fred Kiel was the author of Return on Character, the study that actually proved out that character outperforms over time. And Fred and his company and team joined up with me in the early days of Rock Investments to analyze the current market CEOs that are currently in the market running companies, utilizing the skills and lessons learned from their book. Fred grew to be a good friend and someone I admired greatly during those time we got to work together. And sadly, he passed away on September 24th, 2022, a few months after this podcast was recorded. I wanted just to read you a little something I wrote on Fred. And, but before I do so, there's a photo next to this little, tribute. And it's a picture of Fred in white overalls in a red Hawaiian shirt and a yellow undershirt with red glasses. And he's got, the Rock logo, the heart logo pinned to his overalls. And it was taken just as he was entering the hospital for this surgery that he needed to have done, which unfortunately resulted in his passing. But he's got the biggest smile on his face, and man, it just warms my heart to see the photo. For those that you are watching, you'll be able to see this. For those that are listening, unfortunately, it won't. But I wrote this about Fred. Fred was our patron saint of character that made us all feel good, gave us courage to try, and a belief that good can win in the end. He was the author of our cause, and for that will forever be the cornerstone of our efforts to affirm and promote character in the world. Enjoy this podcast with Fred Kiel. I was honored to be able to, I think, be a part of his last interview. He was a very, very special man and near and dear to my heart. Welcome to Return on Character Podcast. I'm Dan Cooper, founder of Rock Investments, and co-hosting with me today is Jess Larsen, founder of Greystoke Investments. It's a great honor to introduce Fred. And Fred is one of those individuals that Providence, or whatever you might want to call it, led me to, because it was in a moment of frustration that I was sitting in my chair at home and I Googled, does anybody care about character anymore in the Google bar? And up popped this book called Return on Character, published by Harvard Business Review, written by a guy named Fred Kiel. And I was so overwhelmed with the existence of this book that I literally, within a few minutes, tracked down his company, which is KRW International, which is developed an entire business around helping companies develop character within its organization, identify and measure it. I called them and left them a message telling them that I'm trying to build an investment strategy that invests on the basis of character and would love to talk to them. Because, when I originally did this strategy 20 years ago and I didn't think anybody else cared about it. Well, I found the man that actually wrote the book on character. And today we have Fred Kiel with us, and it's a great honor to have him with us. Fred, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you very much, Dan. I'm thrilled to be here.
Fred, why don't you go ahead and explain to us the basis of your book, how you came to write a book on character?
Okay, well, it's kind of a long story. It goes back almost 20 years ago. I was sitting around talking with one of my clients who at that time was an executive vice president of American Express. He was in charge of their financial planning field force, which was spun off as Ameriprise today, but at that time it was part of American Express. And we both were aware that over the years we'd seen that there seemed to be a correlation, if not a more direct connection, between the character of the individuals that we all knew in the business world and the bottom line and the results they got. It just seemed like high character people got better business results. So the more we talked about that, and at that time, Dan Goleman's book on emotional intelligence just was
Hmm.
had its popularity, and we both knew Dan, and we thought that Dan's onto something, but we think there's a deeper form of intelligence, that emotional intelligence and all the influencing skills rest upon, and that's something we ended up calling moral intelligence. We actually met with Dan and talked that over with him, and he agreed that made sense, and actually endorsed our book. We then did a lot of background research. We figured we probably weren't the first guys that had ever thought about this concept of moral intelligence, and of course, it goes back to ancient Greeks and all of that.
Yeah.
So for a couple of years, we hired a researcher who just scoured the literature and tried to find out everything there was written about morality and moral development and all of that. And that got us into the neurosciences, where we discovered the power of habit. And it also got us into the field of cultural anthropology, much to our
Hmm.
surprise. Well, there's a book that was published in, I think, 1989 called Human Universals. It was published by a cultural anthropologist professor. And basically, what it is just an encyclopedia of the behaviors that are common to all human societies around the globe. It's what people in every culture teach their children. And it
Hmm.
turns out, if you look at all this list of behaviors, there are things like telling the truth and keeping promises and owning up to your own mistakes and being responsible for your personal choices and showing forgiveness and compassion, kindness to other people, especially those in your tribe and your family. And as we looked at all of those, we reasoned that, there's a theme here. You can pick out themes. And we came up with four themes: integrity, responsibility, forgiveness, and compassion. And we realized that if these are universal, that all human societies teach them, they really are moral principles, that these behaviors rest under the umbrella of these moral principles. And that's how we came to write this book called Moral Intelligence. Um, we came up with a leadership model. It was based on these four moral, universal moral principles, and interviewed a lot of people that we respected as senior people, and wrote this book called Moral Intelligence. It was published by Wharton Business School Publishing, and it's in 7 or 8 different languages. Actually, it's in the second edition. It's still doing well in many parts of the world. Um, but about 6 months after that book was published, I had a call from a reviewer, and he said, "Fred," he said, "I need to give you a lesson in economics." And I said,
Hmm.
"Oh, well, yeah, what's that?" He said, "Well," he said, "I read your book and all that soft stuff you talk about. I know you think that's important, and I'd expect that because you're a psychologist. But let me tell you, that's not what accounts for. It's nice to have, but it's icing on the cake, because the only thing that really creates value is a good business model. If you have a good business model, you'll make a ton of money, especially if you happen to have a tailwind. And you can attract that way. You can attract all the good talent that you want from making a lot of money, and all that nice stuff you say is so important will kind of come along for the ride. Usually," he said, "even if it doesn't, as long as management stays legal," he said, "that's all that's really required." But he said, "Everything you think is so important," he said, "is just icing on the cake. It's not really, doesn't contribute any value." And he said, and besides, he said, "I read your book." He said, "You make all these incredible claims of how important that stuff is, but you don't have any data to support your claim. All you did was talk to a lot of people that agreed with you." Well, I got off the phone and I was pretty discouraged for about 10 days or 2 weeks, thinking that I'd devoted my entire career to icing on the cake. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed to me that my experience was that it is an important factor. But this guy was right. I don't have any data. So that set me on the mission to get the data. I thought, I know a lot of CEOs. I bet you they'd be glad to cooperate in a research study, especially if we find that this is really important, then it's something that we can take to business schools and say, hey, you need to add this to your curricula. And, CEOs were eager to sign up for this. So I optimistically thought it would take me 2 years. It ended up taking 7 years to
Wow.
have the book ready for publication. But over that 7 years, we signed up 121 CEOs, ended up with complete data on 84 of them. And complete data meant that we had conducted a random survey of randomly selected employees,
Hmm.
asking them questions about the CEO and the senior team around these four moral principles. How often do they show integrity? How do they tell the truth, keep their promises? How often do they demonstrate responsibility, owning up to their own mistakes, expressing concern for the common good? And how often do they demonstrate forgiveness towards other people? How do they react when people make mistakes? And and finally, do they show compassion? Do they just treat people as people? Do they care for the workforce as human beings? And we ended up with over about 8,500 randomly selected employee surveys with that 7 years. And so
Wow.
that allowed us to identify those CEOs and senior teams that their employees thought that they were just terrific people to work for. They were high character in all four of those dimensions. And there were another group of CEOs that scored very low on those dimensions. Now, what was really interesting is that, well, a lot of it was really interesting, but what was really interesting is that both CEOs who employees rated them very highly and those CEOs whose employees rated them very lowly, they both rated themselves highly. They both thought of themselves as being people with high character.
Meaning the CEOs that were rated poorly by the employees thought of themselves as actually having high character.
Absolutely. Their intentions were good. And when it was part of our research agreement is that we would show them the data that we collected from their employees, give them a report. And when we gave a report to the high scoring CEOs, they thought, yeah, that makes sense. I kind of figured I'd score that way. Whereas we showed this same report to those that scored low by their employees, they were astonished and they were horrified.
Mm.
They were distressed. They didn't This is not how I see myself. How can they view me? How can they view me as a person who lies, who cheats, who doesn't tell the truth, who treats them like objects? They were just horrified by that and wanted to do something about it. So,
Fred, was it hard to get CEOs to sign up? And do you think that all the CEOs that you signed up to be able to run your evaluations, you- did they assume kind of that they would fare very well, and
yeah,
that's why they agreed to you guys coming in and doing your review?
I think they were attracted by the higher purpose of this. The higher purpose was if we can show what's important, and that character is really important in producing business results, then it's something that business schools should be teaching.
Right.
And business schools teach ethics courses, but that's a head exercise and it doesn't have much impact on people. But if we can identify the methodology for helping leaders learn how to have better character habits, that'll be the real secret. Well, anyway, CEOs were inspired and eager to sign up on that. But we also asked each CEO that was in the study to nominate two or three other CEOs. So there was sort of a social desirability aspect to this, is that they'd email somebody, say, I participated in the study and I recommended you, you'll be getting a call. And we sent them a nice engraved invitation and all of that. And, made
Yeah.
a big deal out of it. And, who wouldn't want to respond if you know another CEO that respects you, that recommended you for a study in integrity and, and character study. So
So it was able to kind of, you were able to grow through the collective network and get participants to join the
right, we
review.
had no problem
Yeah.
getting people to sign up. We did have problems sometimes getting past HR departments because they didn't want their employees surveyed. And So that's why we signed up 121. We only got data on 84 because things happen. Sometimes CEOs change jobs or quit or whatever,
Sure.
but we ran
Yeah.
on the HR resistance.
Well, I've got one more question for Fred, and I want to give Jess an opportunity to ask his because he's just recently finished your book and uh, and found it incredibly interesting. But um, you know, one of the questions is, were you ever concerned that all this research would yield that it doesn't matter, that character doesn't matter, and how did you manage yourself through that? Uh, and then tell us about the time when when you added it all up and you got the results. What was that like?
I'm a data wonk. I love data. So I was constantly just curious. And luckily, we had an advisory board made up of a couple of professors of accounting from Duke University. So they were there to give me moral support, but they they're scientists also. It was an open question for them too. Once we got up to a respectable sample, we had I think had complete data sets on a little over 40 CEOs. We ran the numbers, and holy cow, we were just amazed that high character CEOs and their senior teams were bringing in almost 4 times more to the bottom line than those
Wow.
CEOs and senior teams who were rated low. We sent that data to the Duke University professors and said, Shane, look at this. I must be missing something. What am I smoking? Because these results look pretty good. And he got back and he said, no, your analysis is fine and the results are there, they're accurate. But he said, your sample's small. He said, you need to get more. So this was about 3 years into the study. So I took a big sigh and said, okay, keep plugging along. And once we got up to 85 or 84 data sets, we ran the numbers again and they were even stronger than they were at 44. It was almost 5 times more to the bottom line. So it held
Wow.
up. And then we did a really in-depth analysis. We looked, are there other factors that could be accounting for this? Like maybe it's at that time there was a lot of sort of discussion around the importance of religion, and religious leaders were thought to be more honest and better business people than those that weren't religious. And well, we had gathered data about that, about people's religious practices. So we were able to sort these 84 into 2 groups, those 10 or 11 CEOs who had weekly consistent religious practices in their lives versus those at the other end of the scale who never had entered a place of worship in their entire life. And then we looked at their financial results, no differences.
Hmm.
So we sorted then based on political preferences, because we'd asked each of those CEOs to identify who they had voted for in the past in all of the presidential elections since they had been able to vote. So we were able to identify, I think, 11 hardcore Republicans that had voted Republican at every election, and 12 Democrats, the other end, who had voted nothing but Democrats. And we looked at their financial results. No differences.
Wow.
We looked at other factors like childhood, happy homes versus those who are unhappy homes, and looked sorted them. There were no differences there. Of course, we sorted by education. The MBAs and the PhDs didn't get any better results than the high school dropouts. So we couldn't find any explanation in all that data that we collected, or we sorted by at the extremes of that data and looked at financial results. It was always nothing until you sort by character, by how the employees viewed these people as treating them. Do they tell us the truth? Do they keep their promises? Do they care for us as people? Do they treat us well when we make mistakes, not shame us, blame us? For those that were rated very high on those versus those that were rated very low, there was this huge impact on productivity and on profitability, 5 times more. And of course, a big bump difference in workforce engagement and actually a lower risk profile, fewer lawsuits, and that sort of thing.
Hmm.
So that was the data. So the thing that I regret is that I never kept the name and the number of the reviewer that called me. So, because 7 years later, I give him a call, but I couldn't remember who it was. So,
Well, he certainly deserves some credit, and you deserve some credit for listening and being humble about it and trying to figure out how to answer the question he asked. Jess, turning it over to you. What do you have any questions on your side?
Before I ask my couple questions, I just want to confirm that I'm reading table B4 in the book correctly, because the way I read it, Fred, it looks like if you add up across all these different company sizes, that the total return on assets across these different organizations, different industries, they were doing kind of like 5.2% return on assets total, but that the self-focused CEOs were doing about 1.9%, and that the virtuoso
mhm,
CEOs, these ones with the high moral habits, the character, that they were doing 9.3% return on assets. Am I reading that correctly?
right. Yep.
To me,
Yes.
that's
Yeah.
incredible, especially when you go from companies at sub 500 employees over to the like 10,000 plus employee range, and then it
Yeah.
shows up in these
Right.
different areas. And um, I guess for me, it's fun to actually see the data. You talk about being a data wonk, like everybody has opinions,
Yeah.
right? It's just so much easier to
Right.
share them with some empirical evidence and a reasonable sample size to back it up.
Well, right. I'm a person that I don't particularly like debate or conflict, and I thought I'd better write this book, but I'm going to put all the data in there because if you don't like what I've had to say in the book, well, do your own analysis. Here's the
Yeah.
data.
Um, well, I wish I could remember who said this, but I love the quote. They said, "In God we trust; all else bring data." So, um,
Yes, I love it.
okay. So I think my first question is: there's a term that you've said today that shows up a few places in the book, and I'd love to know how you define it or how you think about it. You talk about seeing people as people, not as objects. Can you talk about what that means to you or how you define that?
Well, sure. I mean, it's what high character people do because high character people have their heads and their hearts connected. They're not just head people. Head people fail to see the whole human being, and they themselves typically are not very integrated as human beings. And unfortunately, that's a big part of Western culture. Is masculinity is very much a head kind of posture to have, and it's even our culture we think of women as being on the heart side, and they're the soft things like compassion and forgiveness and all that. And men, they're the hard driving, the ones that tell the truth and integrity and responsibility and owning up and all of that sort of thing. Well, the real integrated human being embraces both of those sides. When you have only half of it, you only have a half a human being. And unfortunately, that's what's really defined capitalism for us. Capitalism itself as a system is amoral. It doesn't have any moral um, sides to it. It's who practices capitalism that brings the morality to it. And unfortunately, our capitalism has been promoted mostly by a male dominated way of thinking, which does, well, in fact, it was Milton Friedman who said the only purpose of business is to make profit for the shareholders. Well, that is a pretty narrow view of what the purpose of business is. And if business it doesn't exist to help better make the world a better place, it's not going to exist in a few years. I mean, we got huge problems in society that we need to face. And it takes the whole human being to do that. So,
You know, well, it makes me think, you think about one of the areas of business that is so where manipulation and objectification is so tempting for folks. It's sales, right? And there's a sales trainer, Jeffrey Gitomer, who writes a number of books. And I like one of his quotes where he says, all else being equal, people prefer to do business with people they like. All else not being equal, people still prefer to do business with people they like. And when somebody's like actually thinks about me like a real life human being instead of a walking ATM machine, that's so magnetic. How easy is it for me to like them when I believe that they're not putting their commission check above my needs, right?
mm, I had an experience last night. I thought this free app that identifies plants. And I thought I'd got plants in my garden and I don't know whether they're weeds or flowers. So I downloaded it. And then it gives me the big pitch to subscribe for something for $39 a year. Well, I don't want it. I just want this app. There wasn't any way to do it. And I felt, you jerks, you're just all about you. You're not about me at all. And so I ended up deleting the app and got it off my cell phone. But sales, we're doing a big research project right now with the Society for Strategic Account Management. It's a nonprofit organization with all the big companies, big sales companies. The sales departments of big companies are in it. And our purpose is to help them through research to nobilize sales as a profession. And there's a whole hot subject in the whole sales world now about human to human contacts and human to human interaction. And there's a real awareness of the big companies and the real professional salespeople that this is not about making money and all of that. There's the focus. It's about helping them solve their needs and helping them solve their customers' needs, your customers' customers. And it's all about character. And so we're doing research to find out what specific character behaviors are the ones that drive that kind of successful professional sales interaction. So
I love it. Well, maybe one more question before I hand it back to Dan here. I think the only other person that I have found who has done reliable financial tracking on the value of caring about people like this is Bob Chapman and the Barry Wehmiller companies and his book, Everybody Matters. I was so excited to see all those references in your book about him. And, like for me, it's very easy for me to talk to other CEOs and friends when he's like, they've tracked and shown a 23% compound annual growth rate, higher than Warren Buffett's. And he's grown his revenue over $2 billion with 100, at the time of the book, over 100 successful business turnarounds where they buy a company, treat people well, turn the company around. Can you talk about how you found, well, what do we use? Can you talk for just a minute about why Bob Chapman stood out to you so much?
Well, he stood out to me so much because of the whole culture and climate of his organization. I actually made a trip to St. Louis to visit him and all of that, and I was picked up at the airport, and it was just totally treated like the most important person on the face of the earth. And that was just that was the climate, is that people are really important, and everybody is treated. He had all kinds of employee reward programs. There was a red convertible that got passed around that if you did something to be honored, you got to drive that red convertible for a month. And just all kinds of programs like that. He was really an inspiring guy.
Well, Dan, what does that make you think about? What does that make you want to ask Fred next?
Well, I guess to me, Fred, and this is maybe just from my perspective, I mean, what you proved is tantamount to, Einstein's theory of relativity as far as its consequence on the world as a rule of behavior and its consequence on outcomes and the justification for why treating others with compassion, behaving with integrity, why forgiveness matters. It's just like the rules of the universe that I think we've all intrinsically kind of dreamed of as being true, right? But we all never really had the proof to back it up that it actually works, other than maybe you feel good about doing it. I mean, your book, Return on Character, it was published also, you should know, by Harvard Business Review, essentially proved a new law in the universe for behavior and why it actually pays, not only intrinsically in our hearts and the way we live and how we feel, but how the actual physical world operates and the correlation. And to me, it's one of the most astounding pieces of literature or studies that I've come across. Uh, how have people reacted to it, Fred? I mean, here you bring this out. In a way, it's a little bit like Jim Collins, when he wrote the book Good to Great, he discovered all these level 5 leaders. Couldn't
Mhm.
believe it. He was super excited to bring it out, and it had a huge effect. Um, but I mean, then you came out with an even more pointed orientation around understanding this. How have people responded? How's that then shaped your life? Since the book has been published, I know KRW has been launched. I would just love to hear some highlighted stories that you've had as a result of the publishing of this information that you collected over 7 years.
Well, it was received very well for the 18 months following the publication. I was flying all over. I went to Europe 3 times, all over Canada and the US. They gave 46 keynote speeches and innumerable podcasts and other things based on the book. So there was a lot of interest in it the first 18 months or so. And there's been sort of a steady kind of interest in it since. But I'm not a person who very much is into self-promotion. In fact, doing those keynote speeches for 18 months almost killed me. I do not like to be the center of attention, so it was a draining experience for me. But I come from very challenged, humble background. I grew up in a dirt poor subsistence farm in western South Dakota, and ended up coming to McAllister College in St. Paul, and through just sheer persistence, ended up getting a PhD in psychology from the University of Minnesota. So with
Hmm.
those kind of humble beginnings, to be flown to Paris to be the keynote speaker at Harvard Education's annual gathering of the top 250 corporate clients in Europe at the Four Seasons Hotel to be the keynote speaker there was sort of a big jump from the one-room country schoolhouse that I started out
Wow.
in many years ago. And Harvard just have been terrific. They also had me be the keynote speaker in the U.S. at their gathering of their best U.S. corporate clients. So it's been very well received, and there's continued to be interest in this. And the best thing that's happened is that my staff have taken this original foundational work and have um, brought it out of the laboratory and into the real world and created leadership development programs and assessment tools that are really powerful. In fact, you're going through part of this right now yourself, Dan, is to experience it. But we're really able to help companies raise the bar with regard to how they treat people. And if they treat people with these four character habit and universal moral principles, if they embed that in the way the CEO and the senior team, and then if they insist that it drives down through the organization, they become a character-based culture, and workforce engagement goes up, and everything just goes up, including productivity. Of course, they have to have a decent business model. There's no amount of strong character leadership that would have kept Blockbusters in business. Its business model was done. But if you have a business model that's at least, similar to all the competitors, the thing that give you real competitive advantage is the character habits of the organization, the leadership.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Is there something that's been frustrating for you since the publishing of the book? What's your dream? For the consequence of your research and its application in the world today.
Well, I think that we're nearing a tipping point. We hear references to character. When I published the book, you do a Google search on empathy and news items, and then you come up with maybe 3 or 4 uh, news references. That's when I published the book. 2 years later, it's like come up with hundreds of them, and now it's thousands of them, not only on empathy, but on character. I mean, empathy is a part of character. It's sort of a little part. But the big picture is character. And now character is a hot subject. There's just a recent article, I think, in fact, you sent me a link to it from Harvard Business Review about the importance of character of CEOs and the bottom line. Well, that's sort of real connection. The dream for me, and I know that we will have accomplished a lot, is when Harvard Business School decides that they need to have as the core of their curricula a course on habits of the heart. And all of the other stuff that they teach around marketing and strategy and all of that are the technical things that are tacked on around the circle of the core curricula. So that every new class of MBA students that come in undergo the character assessment. What's their reputation? What's their reputation for how they treat other people? And then so that you could compute then a score for the entire class. And they have this required course that leads them through self-reflection and self-awareness and helps them become integrated human beings with their heads and their hearts connected and all of that. And then do another assessment at graduation 2 years later. And I bet you would see the character score for the class go from middle range up to the top range. And that, of course, would be data that would be extremely valuable for a business school to have, because HR departments would swarm to try to hire their graduating students at that point. And I think that time is coming. It's not there yet, but we've got a couple of opportunities that we're working on with the big universities.
Seems like you're implying that character is not fixed.
Not fixed? Oh, you mean as a fixed item? Of course not.
As a fixed part of human. So some people have character, some people don't have character.
No.
Yeah. Is it something that's malleable? Is it something that can change?
Yeah, absolutely. We're all born with the propensity to want to be cared for, nurtured, be told the truth and be treated respectfully and all of that. That's in our DNA. We want to be treated that way, and we're compelled to want to treat other people that way. How we end up as adults treating other people is a matter of our habits that we've learned by the people around us. And if you happen to have the people around you that are really strong in all four of the character habits, you'll probably end up being that way yourself. But these are habits, and habits, as we know, are changeable. You just have to understand what are they and become aware of them. If you're unaware of them, you're not going to be able to change it. But how you treat other people is not a head exercise. It's a heart exercise. It's what you automatically do when you're with other people. When you meet somebody for the first time, you don't stop and think, oh, I must smile and I must say, hi, how are you? And I must treat them respectfully. You just automatically treat them the way that you have learned to treat people. That's your habit. And these habits are around telling the truth. It's your first response to tell the truth, to keep your promises, to own up to or to do what's right. Is your habit to be responsible, to own up to your own mistakes and to express a concern for the common good. Is your habit first way of responding is to treat other people with kindness and forgiveness and curiosity when they make mistakes. And then just to treat them as people. How do you treat the checkout clerk at the grocery store compared to how you treat your colleague or your boss? High character people treat the checkout people just as well as they treat anybody else. So these are our character habits. They operate unconsciously, just like putting your foot on the brake. But once you become aware of what they are and become aware of the physical manifestations, your triggers that you feel that cause you to behave in this way, then you can change those habits. And we all have, we've discovered through this research is just about universally, everybody views themselves as being a person of high character. That's just sort of a given. So their intent is to be great people, and we think that that's who they really are. It's just that their reputation might not be that way, and it's the gap is caused by. So the question is why aren't other people experiencing the real you? And that's what we can help. That's what the KRW has learned how to do, is create this whole great.
Just to clarify, you're saying that most people think they have high character.
Yes.
Which implies a kind of desire for character, but it gets lost in translation. Um, and so how does KRW help people develop and migrate towards uh, a better expression of their desire, which is to have a higher character, but maybe they're getting messed up along the way, and how they communicate it to the people around them. What's how do you bridge that gap? How does that even done? And frankly, it's kind of encouraging to imagine that you can get better at it. And there's a path to growing exceptional character, despite your background or even your past behaviors.
Well, all you need is to identify 20 to 30 people who know you well enough to know how you treat other people and to answer the 360 kind of set of survey questions about you so that we can get a picture on what your actual behavior is. What's your reputation? We know what your intent is. Generally, everybody views themselves as intending to be people that are hiding all these four character habits, but helping you see what the difference is between your intention and your actual reputation, and answer the question, why aren't people experiencing the real you, the person that you intend to be? And once we have that data, then we've got our huge database now, and we use a computer analytics kind of algorithms to boil down and to identify your keystone habits or focus. What is the one or two, based on your data, things that you could do that would be have a keystone effect? The keystone habit is one that when it gets learned and acquired, brings along all kinds of other additional habits that are or behaviors that are related to it. A good an example is that if you decide to acquire a running habit, it turns out that, well, once you get into the habit of running, other good things come along with it. You tend to lose weight, tend to sleep better, and some unexpected things tend to come along. And research has shown that people that get into running become more disciplined in their financial management of their financial affairs. Who would have thought? That comes along with that keystone habit. So there are these keystone habits, and we use our computers and our extensive database to define exactly what that is for you and help you acquire. And we know the whole habit technology on how to acquire habits. That's no longer a secret. A book written by James Clear called Atomic Habits is especially good at revealing how you change habits. And people have been hitting their heads against the wall and trying to change habits. We're called New Year's resolutions for years. That doesn't work because it's not based on the neuroscience of how habits really operate. Habits can be changed, but there's a real technology, a real methodology to doing it right.
It's a lot of hard work, though. I mean, there's a reason people don't change, right?
Well, I think the bigger reason people don't change is they don't know how. Once we help you see what your keystone habit is and how you to get it, identify the triggers that are involved in your habit. It isn't all that difficult.
Well, I tell you, for the audience, I've gone through Fred Kiel and KRW's review, 360 review, and sent out emails asking for input on my character, and we're going through the results process right now. It's been very humbling and incredibly helpful. I encourage anybody to do it. It only makes you better. Jess, maybe you could sign up next, but yeah, the Keystone Habits is our next point of discussion.
You should have my colleague Kelly Garamond on to talk about that, because she's she and the team that reports to her are the ones that are really taking this out of the laboratory and into application, and she's the real expert in that. So,
Well, it's just encouraging that there's a solution out there for organizations to develop this part of their.
well, it really is. It's not rocket science. It's we've really made it clear. It's science, but it's not rocket science, and It's something that everybody can do, and there's a great hunger for it, and a great need, and it connects to our DNA, to who we really are as human beings. People want to be, they want their behavior to be aligned with what their intent is, and we know that most people view themselves as being people of high character, so let's help them demonstrate it, and they'll feel better, and everybody around them will feel better, and the world will feel better.
Well, I got some more questions, Jess, but I want to give you some room to come on in as well. Do you have any more thoughts?
Yeah, that I need to get a 360 on myself and start running.
Funny
So-
guy. If there were a set of indicators that you were looking for in what you would call virtuoso CEOs through just observation, were there certain discoveries in your research that said, man, there's a consistency when they behave this way or they do this? It's a pretty direct correlation that they likely are on the virtuoso scale.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a lot of those. I mean, you watch how they treat everybody in their organization. Do they know the name of the person that they're dealing with in their company that is one of the lower level people? How do they treat them? Those are real markers. How do they react when there's a mistake that's made? Is their first response to ask, what did I do wrong and what's my part of it, and to do that? Or do they go on a blaming, shaming hunt to identify somebody to blame and to, you know, those are real no-nos. Virtuosos don't behave that way. Virtuosos,
Yeah.
their first response is to be curious and to be humble and what's my part in this? Because I must, you know, I must play a part in this or it wouldn't have happened. This mistake wouldn't have happened. Their first response is to be caring and kind to others. One of the CEOs in our research study was Jim Senegal, the founder of Costco, the warehouses. He's since retired.
Yeah.
He was active. He was, in fact, one of the very first CEOs. And one of the things that Jim told me that he always did is he always told his warehouse managers and people in the warehouse, don't think of yourself as a manager, think of yourself as a resource provider. Um, you can just always remember that how the checkout clerk treats the member will reflect how you treat the checkout clerk. So if you don't treat
Hmm.
the checkout clerk with kindness and with care and as a real human being, chances are they're not going to be that way when they treat the others. So that was just a embedded part of the Costco culture. Well, I'm a Costco member and I go to various Costco warehouses, and I've made it a hobby of mine over the years to interview the checkout clerk as I'm going through line and say, how long have you worked here? And it's usually a she, although there are a lot more he's than they used to be. But usually she said, oh, I've been here for 4 years. And I said, oh, great. How do you like working here? Oh, it's great. Really? What do you like about it? And she talk about the great pay and benefits because Costco pays like more than double of what Sam's Club pays. And they close on holidays and stuff so they can have family time and all of that. And I say, well, that's great. Pay and benefits are terrific. Anything else? What else is important to you? And they kind of look a little off and they say, well, I got a good manager. Oh, really? What makes your manager good? Oh, well, she's got my backside. I know I can talk to her about anything and I just get treated well. So, I mean, there you go. That's the culture and action that Jim tried to create. And he's been retired 11 years, and it's not quite as strongly there as it used to be. But I just did that the other day and interviewed a checkout clerk at Costco in Rochester. And I said, how's your manager treat you? So he treats me pretty well. He always responds to my questions, and he's there when I need him. So that's good.
Hmm. And Jim was in a part of your original study, and did he manage to place on the virtuoso scale?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. His whole team. In fact, it's kind of a cute story about that. He opened up his whole executive team to me, and we did this deep dive into all 11 members of his executive team. And then I was given 15 minutes on an executive team meeting one time to come and present all of the results. And I showed them, as a group, they scored up near the top on all four of these character habit dimensions: integrity, responsibility, forgiveness, compassion. And there just wasn't much discussion. And so they thanked me, and I left the room. And the guy that on the team that had brought me in and walked me out, and I said, Bill, I said, there just wasn't much discussion. I said, it kind of seemed to go flat. What went wrong? He said, oh, that's nothing went flat. He said, he didn't tell us anything we didn't know. He says, we all knew we don't beat our wives. He says, there wasn't anything new there. I mean, so, so the Costco team, that's just part of their reality. Of course you tell the truth. Of course you treat people with concern and kindness. All that. That's just part of their culture. And that's the way they were. That's the way they treated each other. And that's the way they treated everybody else. They treated their buyers that way. They treated their vendors that way. So, and as we know, Costco has grown to become the second largest international retailer in the world behind Walmart. A lot smaller than Walmart, but still number two.
Well, and it's got kind of a cult following, right? So and I think Southwest is another great example of that, or, these companies that, and it also kind of flies in the face that founders, should have the permission to be kind of narcissistic jerks. You Herb Keller's of the world, and for Jim Sinegal's, they were founders and they didn't go their way of the kind of reputation of sometimes successful change the world founders.
One of my favorite stories about Jim Sinegal was that he was given an honorary degree from Southern California University. He went there, but he never graduated. And in his acceptance speech, he says, I don't know. He said, I was kind of hoping maybe I'd get a B in chemistry instead of getting an honorary degree. So,
That's great. That's great. Jess?
There's so many subjects here, Fred, but I have a question more about you. I think about, in the world of content marketing, for instance, of instead of trying to push your product down people's throats, how can you magnetically attract people to yourselves? And the guy who started the Content Marketing Institute and made that term popular, his name's Joe Paluzzi. He's been on the show a couple of times. I've read all 7 of his books. I'm a big fan. And he says the number one thing that has brought more people into them than anything else is original research. And it was fun to hear that story for you of, you do all this hard work for 7 years, you get this original research, and now you're being flown around the world to keynote Harvard events. Can you talk about stick-to-itness or persistence or perseverance when, you're 3 years into it and they say, oh, this is great, you just don't have enough sample size. And you're like, like the disappointment or discouragement or the temptations to quit before you really get to the finish line and how to overcome that?
well, I had a particular good cheerleader. He was my agent, and he was the agent that we had of our first book, The Moral Intelligence. And I'd keep in touch with him from time to time. And along about that time, I was getting pretty discouraged, and it just seemed like a huge, I've already climbed one mountain, and now I got to climb the second mountain. I had lunch with him in New York, and I told him I was thinking about tossing it in, and he said, "Oh," and he just got panic stricken. "Don't do that." He said, "This could be this is going to be a very important book." He said, "Don't quit now, please." And so, based on that kind of, well, if he thinks it's that great, then I better keep going. So I kept going, but there was a considerable cost to it. I gave up a lot of billing opportunities because I was busy doing this research. Yep. No, and getting nothing paid for it. But that's never what's particularly motivated me as making money. What's motivated me is living, pursuing a purpose and making a difference in the lives of other people. In fact, I really refocused my life in my middle 40s when I became aware that my reputation was not what I thought it was. That in fact I was seen as a pretty big jerk and not caring for people. I was the CEO of a small publicly held company at that point in time, and I ended up getting fired from them by the board about the same time. So I think evidence that I was being a jerk was pretty apparent. But I went to a spiritual retreat weekend where the focus of the retreat was just to inundate the retreat goers with unconditional love and care, while giving them opportunities to reflect on who they are and all of that. And I came out of that a different person. Came out refocused and repurposed my life. And that was like 10 years before I did this research. But I came out of that convinced that my purpose in life was to help connect the heads to the hearts of leaders of big companies. And I've pursued that ever since. And I find that, well, it's like 40 years or more ago now, but I find that when I keep true to that mission of caring and focusing on the well-being of other people rather than me, that's when I thrive.
That's so great. I feel like I have a little bit of a similar story. I was a 28-year-old CEO of a private equity fund, and I'd gotten to the point where, you know, family matters, like no sacrifice for the family was too big for me to go make more money. And, I have this joke, if you neglect your spouse long enough, eventually they'll resent you for it. So, uh, I ended up getting a coach, the Arbinger Institute that we were talking about before. And I've been cramming all the books down Dan's throat. I got a coach from there, and basically once a week I'd call her, and she'd helped a mentor of mine, this dentist who'd been a leader of mine as a youth, fix his marriage. And I call her once a week, and she'd say how it's going, and I'd come up with all these like self-esteem rationalizations for things, and she'd just say, "I don't know, Jess, I just don't believe it." And she'd just call me on my stuff, and it was like it was like boot camp for those moral habits you talk
Yeah.
about, because she just like, "Oh, I think you're paying me to help you see your own self-deception." So, she wasn't always the most gentle, but massively effective. And so anyways,
You know that she cared for you and respected
yeah,
you.
name's Nancy Smith. She's just great. And then like you, I'm like, well, this changed my marriage. So I thought, man, what if I could do this to the person I love the most? What's it like to work for me? So then I kept her and started doing it at work. And like, it was just massive how big the difference was. And then so I started doing it for other CEOs for fun. And then I started doing it for work, and just really enjoyed it. And I loved hearing your story, and that you've been dedicated for so many years. And I loved hearing you talk about that you got to that point of wanting to throw it in. I'm sure there's a lot of anybody who's done a startup. We get to this point where I feel like, man, this is so important, and this is what I feel like I'm called to do, and it is just wearing me out. And I've burned the candle at all three ends. And you're talking to your significant other, going like, "Am I crazy? Like, I just need a break. Should I just go get a job for a little while, and then we can try this again later?" Which is almost never a good idea, right? And so it's fun to hear. It's fun to hear you say that. And then obviously you did get it over the finish line, and now Dan and I and all these other people get to benefit from proving what you've proved with the data. Um, so I guess it's more of a thank you from me to you.
Well, thanks. And Dan, I'm so grateful that you Googled and found us, because helping you create the Rock ETF that's apparently doing well is one of the greater accomplishments of my life, is what you've done. So I'll take credit for it.
It's truly inspiration. And in full transparency, people need to know that Fred and his company has been the cornerstone of our research in trying to analyze and understand the market as it sits today. But I want to echo also, from a character perspective, we allocate capital on the basis of character and the things that Fred discovered, and the principles that Fred brought to life, then proved that it actually has a correlation with outperformance. And the thing that also strikes me, just that's kind of remarkable, is that you set out down this, some would say, Pollyanna kind of idea of research, right? Oh, we're gonna hopefully show everybody else that character's good and everything's great in the world. Well, there's a lot of people that I bet looked at Fred and said, you know, that's a waste of research. That's a waste of your time because, bad guys win and being selfish works. And let me give you like 30 examples of CEOs that are jerks and they outperform, you know. And so, I mean, what you did is you made a decision to set your time and resources and reputation to go and prove something that really had a binary outcome. And it could, you could theoretically have gone the other direction. And it was a huge risk that I think a lot of researchers wouldn't want to take because it's just too darn scary. Um, and so it took a lot of courage to make the decision, much less continue to pursue it in the midst of, you know, after 3 years, to continue to try to do it with excellence. And you did that. And Fred, I'm going to put you up there with some of the great scientists of our age, Einstein including, um, as bringing forth a rule of the universe um, that we can follow as a society and apply it in our daily life and our business and every aspect of it. And we can rely on return on character findings to not only show us the way, but to be assured that it works and it actually makes a difference in the world. I mean, it's a remarkable piece of literature and piece of research that more people need to understand, more people need to recognize of its consequence. And I think as a consequence of broader awareness, uh, people will apply it in their lives and the world will start to incrementally maybe get a little better.
And
So thank you. I
Fred,
mean,
well, you're
I
very
mean,
well,
you're a
very
real hero
welcome.
to me.
Well, thank you. But I just want to make sure that your listeners understand that I'm not claiming that the only thing that creates value is the character of the leadership team. That's a very important factor, but the bigger factor is the business model and the macroeconomic conditions. This pandemic has
Mhm.
been either a tailwind for some or a headwind for others. And business models, weak ones, have not survived during this time. And then you take a guy like Steve Jobs, there are other leadership qualities that are very important as well, or can override deficits in character. Steve Jobs was one of them. He was a freaking genius with regard to his design skills and capabilities. He was a jerk. He was narcissistic. He was all kinds of those things. But the power of the business model, the macroeconomic times that he lived in, and his genius for design was what just pushed Apple way over the top and created it. He had
Yeah, I call him the productive narcissist. You don't ever want to bet against a productive narcissist.
he also had a management team that just thought he was the cat's meow, and one of them was a guy last name was named Johnson. I can't remember his first name, but he left Apple, was recruited by J.C. Penney to be the CEO at J.C. Penney when it was in trouble. It still is in trouble, but this was like 5, 6 years ago. And he had learned his leadership style by experiencing Steve Jobs. So he came to J.C. Penney and began to behave like Steve Jobs. And of course, you know, everything just went downhill dramatically. He was fired after 18 months by the board, but for those 18 months, he behaved like a mini Steve Jobs on steroids. There's one thing that he didn't realize. Steve Jobs was a genius and he wasn't. He just took all of Steve Jobs' jerk attributes and applied them, and that didn't work so well.
I've actually been thinking about Steve Jobs during this interview. It's funny that the two of you brought him up because, there's a really famous venture capitalist named Guy Kawasaki who wrote some great books like The Art of the Start, but does a lot of keynote speeches. And he was the original evangelist of the Mac computer for Apple, for Steve. Very small team. And it was his job to talk software engineers into writing software for the Mac. This is going to be a thing. You should care. And he compares working for Steve Jobs over at Apple. So he has Japanese heritage, and he says in Japan, Mount Fuji is such a big deal. And he says, there's only two kinds of fools. This is a Japanese saying. There's only two kind of fools: the kinds who never hike Mount Fuji and the kind who do it twice. So he said, you learn so much working for Apple. When people say, "Why don't you go back and work for Apple?" He's like, "Well, you don't need to climb Mount Fuji twice, right?" Um, and you think about how great Steve was at so many things, including getting the best out of other people in certain ways, right? But does anybody think that if he wouldn't have been a little more compassionate and if he wouldn't have um, taken more time to care about people at a deeper human level, does anybody think that would have downgraded his results? I can't think of anybody who would think that would have lowered his output or that organization,
No,
right?
he it was like he was dragging an anchor. He was a sailing speedboat, but he had these anchors overboard that he was dragging. And if he pulled up those anchors, he would have gone even faster.
Yeah. Uh, well, tell us the best places for people to find you guys online, or if there's a CEO today who wants to go get their own 360, or how should they be reaching out?
Well, I guess the best way is just do it on our website, krwinternational.com. And it's all on that website.
Of the 4 character habits, okay, that you identified in your book, you have integrity, responsibility, forgiveness, and compassion. Which one do you have the most? You have the challenges you the most in your daily life to live out?
I think his forgiveness. Um, I grew up in a family led by an authoritarian German father who was not very forgiving of anything, and I learned at his knee. And I'm sort of a perfectionist, and the downside of being a perfectionist is you get annoyed when things aren't perfect. And when I get annoyed, I tend not to be very forgiving, and so I think I'm going to do this 360 that you just did, Dan, and I suspect I'll get dinged in the forgiveness side of things. But
Well, it's all to say that what's kind of neat about, character, um, it's being you've broken it down into 4 areas, which makes working on those 4 areas a lot easier. And it kind of defines things. And I've noticed that, I've certainly got strength in ones and in certain areas, but weaknesses in others. And like you said, habits are changeable. And the big lesson here to me is, we can all work on it and we all can get better at it. And you, Fred Kiel, have kind of shown us a path to do that. So I appreciate you coming on our show and giving us a bit of your time today, and for not giving up on the writing of Return on Character.
well, thank you, and I feel honored to be on your show. So thank you very much for having me.
Okay, I lied. I want to say one more thing. I think one of the fun things about this interview for me was just how infectious your enthusiasm for this was. You talked about making those big revelations yourself, and now it's become like this lifelong thing for you to share that turnaround with other people and try to help other people have that. Like I loved the book, but it's fun to meet you and to see like just how much energy you've still got for it. I mean, like I talked about mine, I hadn't even hit my 10-year anniversary for my marriage, and we just hit our 20-year last month. And thanks. And it worked. And I still it's not my main job. My main job is running our commercial real estate fund, but I just can't help but want to share stuff with those people. And so ever since I finished your book this week that, Dan got me into, I've been thinking of like, who do I need to send this book to? Because look, he's got the proof. It's like the level 5 leader in Good to Great, or it's like the numbers in Everybody Matters with Bob Chapman. It's like, look at this. Here's a third version that actually has the numbers, but this one's dedicated specifically to this. It's not like an add-on, an after effect, it's like the point. And so anyways, it's fun for me to see that you've got such a passion for it so many years later. And, it's like what you said, like by doing it actually makes you happier to become a better person. Right.
Well, that's the kind of the secret sauce is that people, I think we've been made to actually, when we follow these four areas and try to live our best, it grows happiness at a higher relative rate than the other behavior structures out there that we could choose. And it's a byproduct, but it's very noticeable when you start to connect the head to the heart. And lots of times, if you don't have the head connected to the heart, you won't even notice that you're feeling good when you behave this way. So you're not affirmed,
Right.
and so Fred's point of connecting the two is important to receive the benefit, just even internally, much less externally, from trying to live a life of integrity, responsibility, forgiveness, and compassion.
And it's a whole story on how I never set out to become an innkeeper. Who would ever thought I'd be an innkeeper at this point? But I love to hear people's stories, and I love to cook. So I make breakfast and I listen to people's stories. And there's a lot more to running an inn than that, but I don't do any of it. I don't mow lawns. I don't clean roofs. I don't run social media. I don't do any of it, but I do that. And that gives me joy also.
It's a wonderful place. A big plug for the Sacred Clay. We the board are going to go there in October and have our board meeting. It's pretty special.
Yeah. Fred, this was really fun. I really, really enjoyed it, and I loved the book, and I'm glad to see like you're pushing the cause. I think the world needs this more.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Good.
Fred.
Thanks, Dan. You're great.